It was about 3 one Sunday afternoon when I arrived at the cemetery to visit my parents' grave. I kneeled down doing some weeding and then put some fresh flowers on their grave. Afterwards, I sat on the bench and just spoke to them. As I was sitting there, from the corner of my eye, I saw a movement to my left. I know I was alone. The graveyard was quiet and empty. No visitors were there as it was getting late and almost time for the gates to be locked for the day. I turned my head slowly, and sitting next to me was a young woman. She looked about 22 years old. She put her hand on my arm and said, "You shouldn't be here." Her hand was cold as ice, and I froze. She turned and looked at me and said,
I'm going to tell you the story of how I came to be here. Maybe you will then understand. Do not come here alone.
All I wanted to do was run away, but she held my arm in a firm grip I couldn't escape. Then she started her story.
At the edge of the town where I lived, there was an old graveyard that had just always been there. I never paid it much attention until one evening in October 2023. The sun was just setting. It was cold and misty, and, because my boss had kept me late, I missed the last bus home. The only shortcut to get back home before the darkness swallowed me was through the graveyard. I'd been there before, but never this late in the evening. I knew Mom was going to worry if I was late for dinner, so I pushed the iron gate open. It creaked as I pushed it, and that already freaked me out. There was a narrow path from the gate all the way through the graveyard, right to the other side. I started walking. There were rows of tombstones on either side of the path. The names on them were worn, eroded by time and weather, and many were illegible. You could smell damp earth and decaying leaves. It was so quiet, the only sound I could hear was the crunch of gravel under my boots. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves on the ground, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves. The graveyard was creepy, sure, but that didn't mean there was anything to be afraid of. Still, I picked up my pace and tried to keep my head down. As I passed an old mausoleum, I heard something, almost like a faint whisper. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, and strained to listen. The whispering grew louder. It was as if 100 voices were murmuring just out of earshot. I had goosebumps all over my body. I turned slowly, scanning the rows of graves, but there was no one there. The whispering continued, a constant murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My mouth went dry as I realized the voices weren't speaking English. In fact, it was no language I recognized. They were low and guttural, like the voices of the dead trying to communicate from the other side. My breath came in shallow gasps as I forced myself to keep moving. The path seemed longer than I remembered, stretching out endlessly before me. I told myself I was imagining things, that the whispering was just the wind playing tricks on my ears. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. As I rounded a corner, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the path. My legs buckled and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was tall and thin, draped in a tattered cloak that fluttered in the wind. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing. The whispering grew louder. It sounded like it was the figure that was the source of the voices. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. I stood frozen, staring at the figure as it slowly began to float towards me. With each step it took, the whispering intensified, the voices rising in a crescendo of gibberish that seemed to echo inside my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside me now, filling my mind with darkness. The figure stopped a few feet away, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke my name.
Oh my word, I nearly collapsed. I just wanted this woman to let go of my arm so I can get out of there. I was starting to panic because it was getting dark and soon I will be locked inside this graveyard for the night. But she didn't let go. She continued speaking in that slow, spooky voice while holding onto my arm.
I stumbled back, my heart racing, and I tripped over a tombstone that had fallen. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The whispering had stopped, everything was quiet. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away from that place. The path twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the graveyard, but I didn't stop. I could feel something behind me, something that shouldn't be there, but wasn't going to let me leave. I burst out of the trees and into a clearing, my lungs burning. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak. At the base of the tree was a grave, an open grave, freshly dug, with the earth piled up beside it. I skidded to a halt, my arms flailing in the air trying to balance myself. I stared at the open grave in disbelief. There was no headstone, no marker, just a dark hole in the ground. The whispering started again, louder this time, as if the voices were coming from the grave itself. I backed away, but my feet wouldn't move. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling me toward the edge of the pit. I fell to my knees at the edge of the grave, clutching the ground as the earth began to crumble away. The whispering was deafening now, a chaotic chorus of voices that drowned out all rational thought. I looked down into the grave, and my blood ran cold. There, lying at the bottom of the pit, was a coffin. And inside that coffin, I saw myself. My own face, pale and lifeless, staring up at me with dead eyes. I screamed and screamed, but no sound came out. The earth gave way beneath me and I fell into the grave, the darkness swallowing me whole. The whispering voices faded into nothingness as the lid of the coffin slammed shut above me. The last thing I heard before the darkness claimed me completely was my own voice, whispering my name from the other side. The next morning, when they found my body lying at the edge of the open grave, they said I had died of a heart attack. They said I must have been scared by something, maybe a wild animal or a trick of the light. But I know the truth. The graveyard isn't just a place for the dead. It's a place where the living are lured, where the shadows whisper your name, and where the dead aren't content to stay buried. And now, as I lie here in the cold earth, waiting for someone to take my place, I can hear the whispering again. The voices are calling for someone new, someone who will walk the path at dusk and find themselves standing at the edge of an open grave. Maybe, one day, it will be you.
As soon as those last words came from her mouth, I ripped my arm from her grip. I jumped up and ran to my car. I could feel her eyes locked on me, but I kept driving until the gates of the graveyard were growing smaller in my rearview mirror.